Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something genuinely wild. We are objectively decoding an hour-long multi-narrative paranormal broadcast straight out of South Asia. Now, what we're looking at is a fascinating collection of first-hand accounts and really deep-seated local legends. But hey, we aren't just here to swap spooky stories. We're actually going to pull apart the real mechanics of South Asian folklore. We'll analyze the source material to understand exactly how these supernatural narratives are structured, how they escalate, and ultimately what they reveal about the cultures they come from.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 distinct narratives. 1. The Yeti of the Himalayas. 2. The Curse of Black Magic. 3. The Shamal Tree Entity. 4. Shadows in the Madrasa. And 5. The Possessed Bride. I'm going to act as your guide here, because what this broadcast brilliantly does is use this concept of an escalation of proximity. Basically, we're going to start with distant, isolated mountain legends, and then systematically draw closer and closer to human civilization until we end up with deeply intimate, totally physical hauntings.
All right, let's start with our widest lens. Section 1. The Yeti of the Himalayas, the distant cryptid of the mountains. The historical timeline laid out in the source broadcast is just absolutely fascinating, mostly because the consistency of these accounts is so rock solid. Way back in 1832, explorer B.H. Hodgson provides some of the very first descriptions. Jump to 1899, and Lawrence Waddell reports spotting actual footprints. In 1913, a group of Chinese hunters claimed they saw a giant, hairy, monkey-like entity out in the snow. Then we get a massive leap in credibility in 1921. An actual Everest expedition officially documents giant prints near the Rungbuk Glacier. And just 2 years later, in 1923, Major A.L. Cameron reported seeing dark, human-like creatures walking upright along a really treacherous cliff edge. So this folklore isn't just a random myth. It's built on a literal century of compounding, documented sightings.
Now, to put that into perspective, 20,000 feet. Just let that sink in. That is the extreme altitude where that 1921 Everest expedition discovered those giant footprints. The source material really emphasizes that these entities are inherently tied to one of the harshest, most inhospitable environments on Earth. These are places where humans are the vulnerable trespassers, totally separated from the safety of civilization.
Let's shrink our proximity now and move right into a rural village setting. Section 2, The Curse of Black Magic, focusing on village hexes and generational trauma.
So if you're familiar with South Asian folklore, you definitely know what a Kaviraj is, the essential traditional healer or exorcist. The broadcast tells the story of a 16-year-old caller who claimed to be the victim of a targeted hex. It was a Kaviraj who was brought in to neutralize the black magic, dig up buried cursed objects, and actively negotiate with powerful entities like jinns. They're basically the crucial mediators between the human and the spiritual worlds.
The trauma for this 16-year-old caller escalated super sharply one night. He was walking to an outdoor bathroom behind his family's house, and suddenly he encounters this massive, towering entity, completely shrouded in black clothing. According to the source, the entity just looks at the young boy and simply says, "Your time is up," before laughing and completely vanishing. I mean, talk about a chilling escalation of tension, right? It brings the threat straight into the family's backyard.
But the way they resolved this curse wasn't just random magic. It was an incredibly methodical procedure. The Kaviraj diagnosed a twofold curse and followed exact, almost clinical steps. First, he located the physical anchor of the curse, an object buried precisely 3 hands deep behind that outdoor bathroom. Second, because he couldn't risk possessing the fragile teenager, the Kaviraj actually summoned the attacking jinn into his own assistant's body. And finally, the negotiation. To break the blood pact, the Kaviraj had to appease the jinn by offering 11 chickens in a specific bamboo grove. It really shows you just how structured and procedural these folklore remedies truly are.
Moving even closer to home now, Section 3 brings us to the Shamal Tree Entity, a generational haunting.
What makes this particular entity so wild is its shape-shifting nature. When the caller's aunt first saw it at dusk, it threw up an illusion looking exactly like her ordinary grandmother, just peacefully washing clothes by the pond. But later, the caller's actual grandmother encountered its true form in the dead of night, and it was terrifying. A 10 to 12-foot tall floating shadow, pitch black skin, no toes on its feet, thick white lips, and wearing a simple, traditional white dhoti. That jarring contrast between a familiar, comforting illusion and a horrifying reality is an absolute staple of these local legends.
Now, when this entity actively demanded the family's newborn child, and obviously they refused, it retaliated with severe poltergeist activity. And the physical anomalies the caller reported here are just completely bizarre. Heavy stones started violently impacting the tin roof of their two-story mud house from impossible angles, like nearly 20 feet in the air. Half bricks literally rained down continuously, specifically between Maghreb, which is sunset, and 8 p.m. But here is the most unexplainable detail. The caller noted that despite heavy ongoing rain during these attacks, every single brick that hit their roof was found completely bone dry. Seriously, how do you even begin to explain that?
Okay, we're stepping into a highly intimate, enclosed space now. Section 4, Shadows in the Madrasa, Exploring Terror in Institutional Spaces.
During a sudden power blackout at a religious school in Munshiganj, the caller, who was a student at the time, reached out in the pitch black to grab a flashlight he always kept by his bed. But instead of hard plastic or metal, his hand grabbed something else entirely. He described touching an invisible entity sitting right next to him on the bed, and he specifically stated the texture was unimaginably soft. It's this deeply visceral, tactile description that brings the haunting quite literally to the narrator's fingertips. And the thing is, this wasn't an isolated event. This is exactly how communal folklore builds. Rumors spread like wildfire from dorm to dorm as other students at the madrasa reported a shared, terrifying sighting. The stories started to coalesce into something highly specific: a towering, headless entity, standing over the main staircase, straddling the steps in the dead of night. It perfectly illustrates how localized legends mutate and grow within the strict boundaries of institutional environments, basically feeding off the collective anxieties of the students.
Finally, we reach our absolute closest point of proximity. Section 5, The Possessed Bride and the Intimate Takeover.
Imagine witnessing this happening in your own home. The caller recounted the rapid, super alarming escalation of his newlywed wife's symptoms. It started physically, with her chest aggressively pushing upward while she laid in bed. Then the compulsions kicked in, devouring 8 to 10 biscuits simultaneously, staring blankly into dark corners, and just repeating, "I will eat," over and over, almost like she was being actively coerced by an unseen force. Then her behavior broke the boundaries of the house entirely. She effortlessly climbed a thin tree during broad daylight, hallucinated a white cloth corpse out on their veranda at sunset, and eventually sleepwalked directly to a local graveyard at 3 a.m. And according to the Cavarage who treated her, this massive internal takeover was entirely rooted in a childhood encounter she had years prior under a banyan tree. The entity hadn't just appeared, it had literally just waited.
We've traced this anthology from the frozen, distant footprints of the Yeti all the way down into the internal takeover of a possessed bride. The escalation of proximity here is completely undeniable. But when we look at the structural breakdown of South Asian folklore, what are we really seeing? Are these deeply intricate stories just cultural mechanisms for processing trauma? Are they manifestations of severe psychological stress? Or maybe reactions to environmental hazards? Or is there a threshold where the evidence points to something truly unexplained? I encourage you to look at the patterns we've explored today and decide for yourself. Thanks for exploring the unknown with me on this explainer, and keep your curiosity sharp.